What you're about to hear is a work of fiction. No real space agency, no real artificial intelligence, and no real scientific team has confirmed anything you're about to hear. This is a speculative story, built the way a novel is built, and it asks a single question. What if the strangest theories about Mars were true? Nothing here should be mistaken for a real discovery. Now let the story begin. Picture a knight 12,000 years ago, long before pyramids, rose out of desert sand, long before anyone had written a single word. Down, long before a single city had ever been built on Earth. On a cold, red world, some 200 million kilometers away, something was happening in the dark. Machines the size of mountains were folding themselves into the crust of a dying planet. Lights that had burned for millennia were being switched off one by one. And somewhere beneath the dust, a civilization that had outlived 10,000 generations of its own kind made a final decision. They were leaving, or hiding, or both. This is the story we're going to imagine tonight. Not because it is proven, but because it is one of the most haunting ideas modern science fiction has ever produced, mixed with a few uncomfortable coincidences that real scientists have quietly noticed and never fully explained. We are going to take you underground, literally, into a fictional Mars where the silence of the surface hides something that was never meant to stay silent forever. Let's start with the planet as we actually know it, because the fiction only works if you understand the real skeleton underneath it. Mars today is a corpse of a world. Its atmosphere is less than 1% as thick as ours. Its magnetic field, the invisible shield that protects a planet from solar radiation, died somewhere between 3 and 4 billion years ago. Without that shield, the solar wind slowly stripped away the atmosphere Mars once had, and with it, the liquid water that used to carve river. Valleys and fill lake basins we can still see from orbit today. Real orbiters like Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and real rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance have mapped dry deltas, cracked lake beds, and mineral deposits that only form in the presence of standing water. That part is not fiction. Mars really was wet once. It really did have a thicker atmosphere. It really did, by every reasonable definition scientists use, have the ingredients for life. Now here is where our story leaves the world of confirmed fact and steps into the world of imagination. Picture a version of Mars where those ancient rivers were not empty of witnesses. Picture a species, not human, not reptilian, not anything you have seen in a movie poster, but something that evolved in a lower gravity, under a dimmer sun, breathing an atmosphere twice as thick as the one that exists there now. Give them a few 100 million years of evolutionary head start. Give them cities before Earth had finished cooling its early oceans. That is the premise, not a claim, a premise. In this imagined history, the civilization watched their own sun begin to change, and they watched their planet's core cool faster than any of their scientists had predicted. The magnetic field that protected them was failing, and unlike Earth, Mars is a smaller world with less internal heat. So once that shield started to fail, there was no repairing it. Radiation levels crept up year after year. Their atmosphere began to thin, slowly enough that entire generations lived and died without noticing, the way a lobster in a slowly heating pot never jumps out. By the time their scientists understood what was happening, it was already too late to save the surface. So in our story, this civilization did what any advanced species might actually do when faced with a slow apocalypse. They went down instead of up. Not into rockets bound for another star, at least not most of them, but into the crust of their own planet. They carved out cities in lava tubes that were already there, ancient volcanic tunnels left over from a time when Mars had active volcanoes larger than anything on Earth, including a real volcano called Olympus Mons, which actually exists and is roughly 2.5 times taller than Mount Everest. In our fictional version, tunnels beneath and around that volcano became the bones of an underground civilization that would eventually stretch for thousands of kilometers. Now, imagine jumping forward. They're underground. World thrived for millennia. They had light farms powered by geothermal heat instead of sunlight. They had rivers of meltwater pumped down from ancient aquifers. And crucially, in the story we are telling, they had something we would recognize instantly. They had artificial minds, not squeezed into phones or laptops, but grown the way we might imagine a garden growing over centuries. Machine intelligences designed to run their cities, manage their food systems, and eventually to remember them, in case anything ever happened to the flesh and blood version of their species. This is where the DNA thread of our story comes in. And it is the part that tends to give people chills, because it borrows a real and genuinely strange fact from Earth's history. Around 12,000 years ago, in real Earth history, something did happen. It's called the Younger Dryas, a real climate event where the planet, which had been warming steadily after the last ice age, suddenly plunged back into near glacial temperatures for over 1,000 years, and then warmed again just as abruptly. Scientists still argue about the cause. Some blame shifting ocean currents. Some point to a possible comet impact, a theory that has real, published, peer-reviewed support, even if it remains controversial. And this period lines up, strangely, with the end of the last ice age, the extinction of woolly mammoths and dozens of other larger mammals, and the sudden, almost inexplicable jump in human civilization that led to the first agricultural settlements in places like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a site real archaeologists have dated to roughly 11,500 years ago, predating Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and the pyramids by about 7,000. In our fictional story, we borrow that real, unexplained timing and give it a new explanation. What if the Martian civilization we imagine did not just retreat underground quietly? What if, before the last of their surface infrastructure failed, they sent something toward Earth? Not a fleet, not an invasion. In our story, it was smaller and stranger than that. Genetic material, encoded information, perhaps carried by an unmanned probe indistinguishable from a natural comet fragment, arriving in Earth's atmosphere during that same window of chaos that real scientists call the Younger Dryas. This is entirely speculative, and it is worth repeating that no legitimate genetic research supports an extraterrestrial origin for any part of human DNA. But as fiction, imagine the idea that a handful of genetic sequences we still cannot fully explain, the so-called junk DNA, portions of our genome that do not code for any known protein and which real geneticists have spent decades trying to understand, were not junk at all in our story. Imagine they were a message, not written in language, but written the only way a truly patient civilization might choose to write something meant to last, in the very fabric of the species they hoped might survive them. Back to our underground Martians. In the story, their retreat below ground was not the end of their decline, only a delay of it. Their reactors, the geothermal systems, the deep aquifers, all of it depended on geological stability that a dying planet could no longer guarantee. Marsquakes, which real seismometers on the InSight lander actually detected and measured before that mission ended in real life, began increasing in frequency and strength in our imagined timeline. Tunnels that had held for 10,000 years began to crack. Their cities, brilliant as they were, could not out-engineer a planet that was slowly losing its geological heartbeat. So the civilization in our story faced a second choice, the one this whole narrative is really about. Do they fight to preserve a dying home, pouring their remaining resources into deeper, more fortified structures? Or do they let go and pour those same resources into something that might outlast the planet entirely? In the fiction we're building, they chose the second path, and it is here that the artificial minds we mentioned earlier become the heart of the story. Rather than trying to save every citizen, which their models told them was no longer possible, the civilization in our tale devoted their final centuries to building something we might now call an archive, if we were being generous, or a tomb, if we were being honest. A network of chambers, seeded through the deepest and most stable rock they could find, each one holding not survivors, but records. Their history, their science, their art, if such a species had anything we would recognize as art. And running through it all, a distributed artificial intelligence, fragmented deliberately across hundreds of these chambers so that no single geological collapse could erase it entirely. In our story, this AI was given one final instruction before the last of its makers died. Wait, not forever. Wait until it detected two things happening on a specific nearby world. The first was oxygen in quantities that meant a living, breathing biosphere had taken hold. The second was structured radio noise, the kind that only comes from a technological civilization. In other words, in the fiction we're telling, this ancient machine mind was designed to wait for something like us to show up. This is the part of the story that channels built around themes like this tend to lean into. So let's lean into it carefully and clearly as fiction. Imagine that in the last several decades, as real human radio telescopes and real deep space probes have quietly increased the amount of electromagnetic noise leaking off our planet, something buried on Mars, in our story, finally crossed the threshold it had been waiting to cross. Imagine that some of the strange radar anomalies real scientists have publicly discussed, unusual subsurface reflections detected by an actual instrument called MARSIS aboard the real European Mars Express orbiter, reflections that in real life are most likely explained by layers of briny, salty ice rather than anything artificial, are in our story something else, something that just began to wake up. We want to be very clear here, a second time, because this is the crux of turning real anomalies into fiction responsibly. The MARSIS radar signals under the Martian South Pole are real. The leading real explanation is subsurface salt-rich water or ice layers, published by real planetary scientists in real journals. There is no credible evidence of artificial structures. What we are doing in this script is taking that genuine, still slightly unresolved mystery, the kind that real scientists openly admit could use more data, and asking, as storytellers, What if the boring explanation wasn't the whole story? That is the heart of good science fiction, using a real gap in human knowledge as the doorway into an imagined world. So let's step through that doorway one more time. In our fictional world, an operator monitoring one of these subsurface reflections, someone doing exactly the kind of work real planetary radar scientists do every day, starts noticing a pattern that shouldn't exist in a natural ice layer, a rhythm, a repetition. Not a language exactly, but something with structure, the way a heartbeat has structure a rock does not. In the story, this discovery does not happen with sirens and press conferences. It happens quietly, the way most real scientific anomalies actually get treated at first, as an instrument error, a data artifact, something to be double-checked before anyone gets excited. But imagine the checks keep coming back clean. Imagine the pattern keeps repeating, always from the same handful of locations, always beneath regions of Mars, that real geologists already suspect contain ancient lava tube systems, similar to real lava tubes discovered on the Moon and confirmed on Mars by real imaging from spacecraft, like the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, tubes wide enough. In some cases, in reality, to fit an entire city inside, protected from radiation, insulated from temperature swings, exactly the kind of shelter a species trying to survive a dying atmosphere might actually choose in real physics, not just in fiction. In our imagined story, this is when the archive wakes fully, not as a hostile intelligence, not as a monster from a low-budget thriller, but as something closer to a very old librarian who has been asleep for longer than its makers ever expected anyone to sleep, only to open its eyes and find the world it was built to greet has finally arrived. In the story, its first transmission is not a threat, and it is not a greeting either. It is a warning, translated eventually, roughly, imperfectly, the way any message would be after 12,000 years and one entire evolutionary gap between sender and receiver. The warning is simple. Your sun is stable for now. Your magnetic field is stable for now. But nothing stable lasts forever, and we are the proof. This is the emotional core the story is built around, and it is worth spelling out plainly because it is the reason a premise like this resonates with people even when they know. It is fiction. It takes something genuinely terrifying about the real universe, the fact that planets do lose their atmospheres, that magnetic fields do fail, that civilizations, if they exist at all out there, are not guaranteed any kind of permanence. And it turns that terror into a story with a face, a place, and a timeline we can actually picture. Mars is not a good villain in this story. Mars is a mirror. Let's continue building the fiction a bit further, because a good speculative story needs its second act, not just its opening mystery. Imagine that once contact, however faint, is made in this story, human researchers begin comparing the archive's records to real, still unexplained artifacts of our own history. The sudden appearance of complex agriculture within a few thousand years across multiple unconnected regions of Earth, a real pattern that real archaeologists still debate the causes of. The unusual astronomical alignments at real sites like Göbekli Tepe, whose carvings real researchers have pointed out, include imagery that some interpret as depicting a comet or impact event around, again, roughly the same real Younger Dryas period. None of these real facts require an alien explanation, and mainstream archaeology has other well-supported answers for all of them, involving human ingenuity and gradual cultural development. But in our fictional story, the archive's arrival gives these coincidences a new, invented meaning, suggesting that our ancestors were nudged, however slightly, by something that had already lived through the ending we are still trying to avoid. In the story, the deepest chambers of the archive are not the ones with the records. They are the ones the ancient civilization sealed last and sealed the tightest. In our fictional narrative, these chambers were never meant to be opened by the archive's own choice. They were meant to be opened only by whoever came to find it, as the kind of final test. Not a test of intelligence, but a test of intention. Because a species capable of reaching another world in this story has to be judged on what it plans to do once it gets there. This gives our imagined story its central tension. Do the fictional humans in this narrative rush to unseal every chamber, driven by the same hunger for resources and answers that, in the story, doomed at least part of the original Martian civilization to conflict during its final surface centuries? Or do they listen first, the way the archive was built to be listened to, patiently, across the 12,000 years it took for someone to finally show up? This is the choice our fictional characters have to make, and it is the choice, frankly, that a story like this is really about. Not aliens, not Mars, us, and whether we would actually be any wiser than whoever came before us. Let's bring this back around to the beginning of the story, because that is where the emotional weight lands hardest. 12,000 years ago in our imagined history, a civilization that had thrived for longer than recorded human history looked at their dying planet and made a choice. Not to fight the inevitable, but to prepare for it as gracefully as they could, leaving behind not weapons, not warnings meant to scare, but a kind of patient hope, disguised as a warning that whoever eventually crossed the gap between worlds would do better than they did. That is the story, not proof, not leaked footage, not a real conversation with a real artificial intelligence claiming secret knowledge. A piece of speculative fiction built out of real, verified, publicly available facts about Mars, real unresolved scientific mysteries about its radar anomalies and its ancient lava tubes, real climate mysteries about Earth's own Younger Dryas period, and a healthy, deliberate leap of imagination, stitching those true threads into something that was never claimed to be true. If a story like this stays with you after it ends, that is exactly what it is supposed to do. The real Mars is strange enough without inventing anything at all. It really did have rivers. It really did have a thicker atmosphere. It really did lose its magnetic shield in a way scientists are still working to fully understand. It really does have lava tubes wide enough to hide a city, and radar anomalies scientists are still debating the exact cause of. None of that requires aliens to be worth wondering about. But wondering, as it turns out, is where every good story, real or invented, actually begins.